All right, everybody, I am back with a brand new DC update. And this update is all going to be about Superman spoilers. A lot of people have asked me to do this video after seeing the film last night. And I see that all the spoilers are being put out there. And so I figured I would do some of my thoughts on the film and dig a little deeper into my thoughts on some of the plot lines and things that happened throughout the film. Now, first of all, I want to talk about the hypocrisy of what people are going to say they loved about this film that goes directly against what people complained about with Man of Steel and Batman vs. Superman. There are some direct comparisons between the two films. And first off, the whole political storyline with Superman being an immigrant and going where he shouldn't go. That is a rehash of what happened in Batman vs. Superman. They do it in this film as well. So it's a one-to-one. You have Lex Luthor. He ends up, at the end of this film, killing way more people with some massive destruction that Man of Steel, like it eclipses what Man of Steel did. So in Man of Steel, everybody complained at the end, all the destruction and how many people got killed. And in this film, way more people get killed. Like there is some massive destruction at the end of this movie, all because of Lex Luthor. And so there are some direct comparisons there. Superman getting arrested. He actually turns himself in this like he did in Man of Steel. There are direct comparisons, and the most hypocritical one is everyone complained with Batman vs. Superman how there were too many characters. And you want to talk about too many characters. There were way too many characters in Superman. In fact, there were two characters that really did not get their due. One of those was Hawkgirl, and in fact, her scenes were quite annoying. She comes off as silly and dorky, and in fact, she has a scene in the film where she kills somebody to prove that she's not like Superman. That's the only reason she kills this individual. Lets him die. Not just lets him die, drops him from a great height to kill him because he told her, oh, you're just like Superman. You won't do anything to me. She says, I'm nothing like Superman, and drops him. Really? And there's during that scene where she goes to get this individual, she screams, and it's awful. It's this horrid sound that they put in the film. Like, this character did not need to be in the film at all. They didn't give this character anything to do. There was no point to it, other than showing that these characters don't want to be anything like Superman, which is kind of dumb. I think anybody's going to want to emulate who Superman is, and especially if they're going to be your heroes. And then, the amount of characters. There are so many characters in this movie. And I could see why James Gunn was originally going to call this Superman Legacy, because he takes so many story beats from stories that came before, from Superman for All Seasons. You got the one that I really don't like by why am I forgetting everybody's name right now? I'm just having a blank. I'm extremely exhausted. I'm very nasally today from doing yard work, and so it's been a busy week. I haven't had time to do a lot of anything. So you'll have to excuse me if I'm forgetting some of the titles. In fact, I read this story, and James Gunn said this movie was based off of it. And he basically took a bunch of story stuff and jammed it all into this movie to make this film. And because of that, and the screen, the film is only just a little over 2 hours, you don't have any time to let the story breathe. So many times they wanted to make it so clear that Superman wants to save people. And all the times where he saves like animals or people, it happens so quick. Like with the squirrel, it's a quick thing, it's done. He saves the girl from the kaiju, it's quick, it's over. He puts the girl on the top of the building, it's over. They move on, and they showed you a lot of the people that he saved in a lot of the trailers. Like they showed way too much. At first they weren't showing anything, and then they let the floodgates open in those last 2 weeks, which I don't think was the right move to do. But let's talk about kind of the flow of the film here. It starts out with Superman losing his first battle. There's a crawl at the beginning saying that superheroes have been around for, I can't remember if it was 2 or 3 centuries, and that Superman has been around for 3 years. So he's been around for 3 years. He's got his Fortress of Solitude, and he just lost his first battle after having to fight this character, the Hammer of Baravia, from this country. And he ends up beat up, and he has to be healed in the Fortress of Solitude. And then you see this, there's images of Superman's birth parents from Krypton, and they're telling him the story of why they sent him there. And it's what's driven him. It's what's made him, feel like he needs to save people. He thinks it's a good message. But part of the message is not, he was never able to retrieve it. It was damaged, in the trip there. And so we don't get to see what the second part of that message is. But Superman quickly gets back into the fight. And this is where he goes, I got to get back into the fray, even though he was only at 85%. And that's when, as he's leaving the fortress, Krypto has destroyed a lot of stuff, and he really is not happy with this dog. This dog gets in the way a lot, but also saves Superman multiple times during the film. So he gets back in to fight this Hammer of Baravia, and you find out that Lex Luthor is the one who has concocted this whole thing between these two countries. And the Hammer of Baravia is really Ultraman, who ends up really being a clone of Superman. So a lot of people were assuming that Ultraman was going to be Henry Cavill. It's not Henry Cavill. It's David Corenswet with longer hair. And he's dumber. So I thought they were going to go the route of eventually turning him into, Bizarro. And here's the crazy thing about this. You also have the Engineer in this. And they just jammed all these characters into this film to show that Lex was concocting all this stuff between these two countries. You find out that Lex has also created this pocket universe that could rip a hole, create a black hole if it's just off a little bit, and would suck in, the world, could create rifts and all kinds of stuff. And this is where Superman ends up being held captive, and he goes there basically on purpose, because what ends up happening is when they're at the Fortress of Solitude, taking all of his information. And that happens very quickly. Like after this whole battle with the Hammer of Baravia at the beginning, then, the Engineer's telling Lex that they'd pretty much figured out where Superman's lair is, and they just got to go find it real quick. And so they go off and do this. This is all like in the first 15 minutes of the film. And as they're getting the information, pulling stuff from Superman's past, I talked about this in my review, that's when the Engineer is like, I'm worried that Superman's going to come, while we're doing this. And that's when Lex says, I have it covered. And that's when it goes back to his henchmen in Metropolis, dropping off this little kaiju. And he goes and, breathes fire onto a little box and runs off. And then the very next scene is Superman holding up, the foot of the kaiju. And it's just there in the middle of Metropolis. And you wonder how it got there without breaking any buildings, because it's surrounded by a bunch of buildings. And it doesn't destroy any of the buildings, and you got people there watching, taking pictures. It's the craziest thing. None of it makes any sense. And if he was using this to stop them, they're not going to still be at the Fortress of Solitude a day later, or the next day. The editing choices here and the logic behind it make no sense. And the only thing I could figure, and this is where the flow and the issues come in with the storytelling, that maybe they had dropped off the kaiju in Metropolis the night before, but it happens after Lex is at the Fortress of Solitude. It's just not logical with the way the story flows. And so, who knows? During that kaiju scene, it's really crazy because Superman makes it very well known he doesn't want to kill it. And this is when the Justice Gang comes in, and they want to kill it. And it ends up becoming a fight just like the Starro fight, from a lot of one-on-ones, one-to-one comparisons with Starro in Suicide Squad. And so it's what James Gunn knows. He likes these big monsters. In fact, there's a scene later, we've seen the picture with this thing in the background in the sky where Superman was in his apartment and Lois is there. And you come to find out that's a fight that the Justice Gang is having with this interdimensional imp or something. And it doesn't look like anything you would recognize from a Superman comic. And so what ends up happening is he just stays home and lets them take care of it. And that's when he has a conversation with Lois. And that's another thing. I wish there would have been more Superman and Lois in this film. It's glazed over pretty quickly early on in the film, and they have this whole long sequence with them talking, which I thought was completely unnecessary. There were some weird cuts during this conversation, and some of the stuff we saw in the actual trailers didn't even happen in that scene, like where he sits down and he says, "You can interview me." They do talk about it, but it's not portrayed the same as it was in those clips. And it just goes on for too long. It's not really necessary for the story. And you have this whole thing, and then they end up arguing, and Superman leaves the apartment as Clark, okay? And it's weird, like I said, the way it flows. There were some cuts during that scene. Like, they end up kissing in the kitchen, and he puts her up on the countertop, and the next cut, it's definitely not... It didn't have the right flow for where they were just at. It just looked odd. There was a lot of cuts like that in this movie where I don't think James Gunn is a very good director. He doesn't know how to do transitions between the story and what's happening on the screen. And so what Superman ends up doing is he gives himself up because while the engineer and Lex are at the Fortress of Solitude, they take his dog. And Superman says the only way I'm going to be able to find him is by going to wherever he is. I got to go to the government because you have Rick Flag is part of the government, and they've allowed Lex to create this pocket universe to enslave people, basically put them in jail. And they got to go through this portal that's almost like a boom tube. If you're familiar with DC Comics, you'll know what that is. It's very similar to that, where you can enter in one place and end up somewhere else entirely. And so that's what ends up happening here is Lex has enslaved a lot of people in this place, a lot of people who have crossed him over the years. You could tell that they're all there. And what ends up happening is Superman ends up getting held by Metamorpho. This is where we're introduced to Metamorpho. And he actually could see that his dog is being tortured there as well. And that's another thing people need to be aware of in this film is that Lex tortures dogs in this film. He abuses women in this film. It's not a good look. It's not a good look. In fact, like I said, Lex is the worst portrayed character, I think, in this whole film. He's very brash and emotional, not cold and calculating like he should be, and he should have been. But Superman is there, and they use Metamorpho to create kryptonite from his hand. And you find out the reason he's doing it is because across the bay, or wherever it is where they have these little cubes holding everybody, there's two sets of them, two rows of them. And I think they're both double-sided. So there's a group of two, and then there's a gap, and then there's another group of two. So they're in these areas, and across the way is where they're holding Metamorpho's son. And Superman tells him, if you free me, I will go get your son. And the only way he can be healed is if he has a way to regenerate, because when Metamorpho lets the kryptonite go away, Superman's not getting any better. Now, during this scene, there's also a scene where Lex Luthor brings in someone that had helped Superman earlier in the film, and they end up, Lex Luthor shoots him in the head, and Superman can't do anything about it. And it was supposed to be super emotional, but how quickly this film moves, they don't let any of these emotional scenes simmer a little bit so you can really feel the pain and the suffering that's going on in these scenes. And so Superman, you can see tears coming from his eyes when this guy ends up getting killed, because he's completely innocent, has nothing to do with Superman at all. He just happened to be someone who gave Superman food and help at one point. And so Superman gets really upset. And in this scene where Metamorpho lets the kryptonite go away, he creates something like a sun to give Superman a bunch of power, and then that's where we see him, cut through the glass, and then he goes and gets the guy, Metamorpho's son, and gives it back to him. And at that stage, he gets Krypto out, and there's this whole thing where they end up getting stuck. Some of Lex's men come in, and they end up getting stuck in this lava that kind of looks like, it looks like it's made from stuff like from Minecraft. And they end up getting pulled down there, and it takes both the dog, Superman, and Metamorpho to get out of it because they get pulled into like a black hole area. And Metamorpho has to use his powers to push him out like a rocket. Superman's using his super breath, and Krypto was helping pull. And so they all end up getting out. And at the same time, you had you had Lois figure all out what's going on, and she goes to the Justice Gang for help. And Guy Gardner's like, I'm not getting involved. I don't get involved with politics. I don't deal with anything like this. Hawkgirl just sat there and ignored what was going on. But Mr. Terrific decides to help Lois. And so he goes there, and there's the scene when they're going to where this pocket universe is, the entrance to it. And this is a really cool scene where Mr. Terrific does all this crazy stuff, and James Gunn decides to put a song in the movie. And it was stupid. Should have been some epic music. When it comes to the emotional scenes, James Gunn has no idea how to do emotion right. He just doesn't. He doesn't let things simmer long enough, or he does music, things that really don't drive you when you're watching a film. But at that point, you do have Lois and both Mr. Terrific. They're able to get into this pocket universe, and they all come out together. And Mr. Terrific says he needs to stay behind, and he sends Lois back with his ship back to Metropolis. So everything heads back to Metropolis, Superman, Lois, all of them. And I can't remember exactly what happened with Superman where he got tied up, but he got tied up doing something. You had both Lois and was getting information from Jimmy, and Jimmy was getting information from Miss Tessmacher. And you find out that they had had a relationship in the past, but everything heads back to Metropolis, and you find out that Ultraman and both the Engineer are there to take Superman down, and they tag team him in this, the stadium. And then you have Lois going back and figuring out that Lex is doing, guess what? Another land grab. It's another land grab story by Lex, which amazes me that they decided to rehash that whole story, and they figure it out by photos that Tessmacher had emailed to Jimmy Olsen. And in the background, all this stuff was going on, and they were able to figure out what was happening. And so what ends up happening is Lex gets irritated that Superman is out and decides to create a rift. Now, at the same time, he's using this leader from this other country to restart this whole entire conflict between these two Middle Eastern countries to start this war over there so that he can get his land. And at the same time, Superman can't do it because he's tied up there in Metropolis, and so the Justice Gang goes there to help out with that fight while Superman is dealing with the Engineer and both Ultraman there in Metropolis. And because Superman is getting the upper hand, Lex decides to create this rift. And this rift is going to tear Metropolis apart. Oh, and that's what ended up happening. I totally forgot this one scene, and this is really important. Before Superman got to Metropolis, he ended up having to go back to Smallville because he wasn't at full strength when he came out of the Pocket Universe. He still had some kryptonite poisoning. And so Mr. Terrific said it was going to take a couple of days for him to become normal again. So Superman guides Lois to Smallville. And he stays with his parents for a couple of days to heal. And while he's there, Mr. Terrific gets a hold of him and says, you need to get to Metropolis because Lex is doing something. He's creating this rift. Because he's losing, he's going to create this rift that's going to tear Metropolis apart. Just out of his childish angerness, being angry and wanting to destroy everything. That's who Lex is. In this movie, Lex would be more cold and calculating in the comic. But in this, he's just brash and decides, I'm just going to destroy everything because I'm not getting my way. And so he does this, and it tears all these buildings in Metropolis. So Superman finally gets there to help because Mr. Terrific calls him and says, this is, you got to get here to help. I can't stop this rift, and we need some help. So that's when Superman goes there, has to deal with both the Engineer and also Ultraman. And what ends up happening is you find out that Ultraman is him, just from DNA that Lex had picked up years prior. And he was using it to, basically, he wants to kill Superman and rid the world of Superman. We find that out earlier in the film. He kind of pitches that to Rick Flag and some of the other people. And the way that fight ends, You don't know what ends up happening with the Engineer, and you don't know what ends up happening with Ultraman. These are two big question marks and two big plot holes in the film where you don't know by the end of the film what actually happened to both of those characters. You see the result of the fight and everything, but they don't go any further with saying what ends up happening after these events. It's like a total thrown off to the side, doesn't matter type of thing, because then all of a sudden they wanted to focus on Lex. And when Superman goes there to confront Lex, this is where he has this political speech that a lot of people said was woke. I didn't think it was woke. He just basically said that, he's been trying to kill him because he's coming from another planet. And he goes, my greatest strength is that I love people. I can feel, I can love, I can fear. It's who I am, and it's what makes me who I am. And he feels this way after having a conversation with his dad, because what ends up happening when Lex goes to the Fortress of Solitude, and this is what kicks off a lot of the public hate, and this also happens very early in the film, is the fact that his parents actually sent him there to conquer Earth. That was the other part of the message. And it was confirmed by some specialists. And so Lex put that out there to get people to hate Superman. But Superman, when he's at his house and he's talking to his dad reaffirms to him that it doesn't matter about any of that stuff. What matters is you are who you are, and he looks up to him. And so Superman realizes he's not strapped by his ancestry. It's about his parents here on Earth. And he has that conversation with Lex. And that's when Krypto comes in and starts tearing Lex apart. So when you see Lex all angry and frustrated in the trailer, that is after the fight with Krypto. And so Superman ends up, they obviously end up taking Lex. He gets arrested. They didn't have much for Perry White to do. They didn't have much for Hawkgirl to do. They jammed so much into this film. For this film to really simmer and to make you feel something, the movie would have had to have been about 5 hours long. Instead, what they do is they just throw it all at you all at the same time. It's coming from every direction. You get whiplash from being able to let a scene really sink in. What I really liked about the film was the fact that Superman was portrayed correctly. He was a really good guy. He was very stoic. He was strong when he needed to be. He was resolute. And he never really battled. A lot of people say he had to battle with right and wrong. He never really battled with that in this film. He was pretty on point for the whole film. And so I really like the portrayal of Superman. I like the portrayal of Lois, but we didn't get enough of them. We didn't really get to feel their love for each other. They had a couple of scenes, but we didn't really get to feel it because it's too quick and it moves on. Now, it's also important to note that at the end of this film, that, as I said, the spoilers were true, and Superman did let it be known during the film that his dog is a foster situation. So his sister shows up all drunk, or his cousin. She shows up all drunk to get her dog. She calls Superman a bitch on the way out. And you come to find out because she can't get drunk on Earth, she's been going to a lot of planets with a red sun so she could party and get drunk. And so she does show up drunk. And it was our first introduction to Supergirl. You could see her suit. It was way more tight-fitting than what Superman had. Same logo, same everything, same look. She had a skirt. And so you get your first look at Supergirl in this. We also had Peacemaker in the middle of the film in a news story. And it was just ridiculous. Again, James Gunn can tie all his stuff together. He's bringing in all these things from the things he created, but he's not explaining how this universe is all working. Now, there are 2 post-credit scenes, and they are both not worth staying for. Neither one is. One is basically, well, it's not basically, it's what it is. It's that shot of Krypto and Superman on the moon looking at the Earth. It only lasts for a few seconds, but Kara had already taken the dog, so that didn't make any sense. On top of that, at the very end of the credits, you have a scene with Mr. Terrific and Superman. We've seen that shot in some of the behind the scenes where they're looking up the side of a building together. That's what this scene is, and Superman is basically frustrating Mr. Terrific, saying you couldn't have put the buildings together better. And it frustrates Mr. Terrific, and he kind of walks off, and that's it. So neither of the post-credit scenes are worth staying for. It doesn't add anything to the story. It doesn't build up anything for the future. The stuff with the Justice Gang was very on the surface. You do get to see Maxwell Lord at one point. He's kind of in a news story in the background as well. But that's it. Everything in this movie is on the surface. It moves too quickly. Nothing gets to simmer. The story's not that bad. The problem is the way it was told, and this is James Gunn's fault, okay? He wrote and directed this. The writing's pretty decent, but the execution is not. So what I would like to see in the future is James Gunn stay behind the scenes, not direct anything. I'd really not want him to write anything either, because we've already heard about 20 minutes of comedy being taken out. And with the comedy that was left in, it wasn't, 99% of it wasn't even funny. It just did not hit. In fact, you could tell everybody in the theater getting very, kind of groans and grumbles. And when the film ended, first of all, my showing was not full. It was probably about 75% full, which shocked me that it didn't sell out. And on top of that, when the film ended, you had about 4 people clap, but not hard claps. It was like, oh, okay, that was good. There was like 4 people that did that. When I saw Jurassic World, a bunch of people clapped when that ended. And that just goes to show you what the audience is feeling when they see these movies. Now, right now, as it stands, Rotten Tomatoes is like 80-something for critics, and then it's like 90-some-odd, like 96% for the audience. I really do not know how the audience is going to react to this film, and here's why. This film was made for a very small group of people. People who understand who Superman is and understand the lore in some of these stories, and for people who like James Gunn. That's it. So it's not made for a wide audience. It's not made, and I think a lot of people are going to be upset with the lack of emotion, the lack of cohesion with the story and the way it flows. And I think it's just too much that's going to be added that's going to upset people. So the film could have been way better. It had massive potential, but was wasted. And that's a shame, because this was your opportunity to reintroduce Superman to the public, and you jammed so much down their throat that it's going to be hard to make it justifiable for people to go see this. And I don't think the audience is going to latch onto this. Over the weekend, we're hearing all these reports of $90 million domestic all the way up to $170 million domestic. I have so many people sending me screenshots of their theaters where only 5 or 6 seats have been sold for Friday night. And that doesn't bode well for this film. I think this film is going to do less than $100 million over the weekend in the U.S. I really do. Now, no matter what happens this weekend is where the fans and the people who wanted to see it are going to go see it. Whatever it does this weekend, I do believe we're going to have a massive drop-off next weekend. I do not see this movie making anywhere near its budget back. It literally has to make $700 million just to reach its budget. If the budget was $250 million, you have to understand that the theaters take 50% of the sales on the tickets. And so this film would have to make $500 million just to reach its budget, but they had $200 million in promotional materials and promotions. And so it has to make literally $700 million to break even. Now, Warner Brothers is of the mind it doesn't need to make that. And I will tell you, if it does not make about $170 or $180 million over this weekend, it's not even touching what Man of Steel did 12 years ago. Man of Steel had more tickets sold than that back 13 years ago. And I don't think that's going to bode well for the future. I really don't. Doesn't matter what the reviews say. The reviews could be the best things in the world, but that doesn't mean the movie is going to resonate with the general audience. Most of James Gunn's films tend to get good critic scores and good audience scores. The other thing to note about Rotten Tomatoes is when you give a review, if you give a 2.5 or higher, it's automatically added as a positive. So this could be 96% fresh, but people are only giving it 3 stars. That's how Rotten Tomatoes works for people who don't understand that. So that doesn't mean it's a 5-star instant success because people gave it a positive score. It means it's passable. And I didn't even see this film as passable. Like, they had years to work on this. There's no reason this film had to end up the way it did. None. But David Corenswet was not my issue. Lois Lane was not my issue. Everything else was. All right, guys, so there's kind of my spoiler, kind of running through some of the things that happened. None of these things were memorable. None of these things were things you're going to talk about for years. It's a very mundane, boring introduction into this DCU. All right, guys, so there you have it. I wanted to get the spoiler review out there. If you guys have seen it, please let me know what you guys thought below. I do appreciate the support. We will see you guys on the next video.